Good evening, everyone, or good day, depending on where you are. Welcome and thank you for joining us for the 16th Salem Literary Festival. I'm Stephanie Buck, a member of the dedicated team of volunteers who bring you this festival each year, and president of the Board of Trustees at the Salem Athenaeum, the primary presenter of this beloved festival. Each year, we aim to bring the community together around a love of reading and writing, of exchanging ideas and history and culture through story and the written word. It is now more important than ever that events like this provide opportunities for different voices to be heard, and it is with great thanks and gratitude to our partners, sponsors, and supporters that continue to help make our festival a success. Before introducing our author, I'll give you a quick overview of how this is going to work. We have an anti-harassment policy that will be placed at the top of the chat so you know the rules up front. We don't expect any problems, but we also want you to know it is important to us that everyone feels safe and comfortable. Many of you know all about Zoom, but here are a few tips. Please put your questions in the Q&A and we'll do our best to answer them after our author has finished speaking. Brief comments can be put in the chat. For closed captioning, just click on the CC box on your screen. Now, we're here this evening to hear from Lev Grossman. Lev is the author of best-selling novel The Bright Sword, which was a New York Times notable book of 2024 and the #1 New York Times best-selling Magicians trilogy, which has been published in 30 countries and adapted as a TV show that ran for 5 seasons. He's also a screenwriter and the author of 2 children's books, The Silver Arrow and The Golden Swift. He spent 15 years as a senior writer at Times Magazine, where he was a book critic and lead technology writer. His journalism has also appeared in Vanity Fair, The Atlantic, The Wall Street Journal, The New York Times, Slate, Wired, and many other places. He lives with his wife and children in Sydney, Australia. Good morning, Lev, and I will pass things over to you.
Morning. I am in Sydney, Australia, which is why it's morning here. Although I feel like I should start with giving my Massachusetts bona fides. I did grow up in Lexington, Massachusetts, and I went to college in Cambridge. My family is still there. It's a long story about why I'm currently in Sydney, Australia. But like all Massachusetts kids of my generation and probably the current generation, we did do a field trip to the Salem Witch Museum, which completely freaked me out, and I had to go outside. I was a sensitive child. Um, I want to talk today about King Arthur, uh, and I want to tell not so much the story of King Arthur, but the story of King Arthur. Last year, I published a book called The Bright Sword, which was a novel about King Arthur. It took me 10 years to write. Uh, and after about 2 of those years, my family said that they never wanted to hear about King Arthur ever again. So I'm very grateful to you guys for sitting and listening. When I started looking into Arthur, I had a I had a layman's knowledge of King Arthur. I probably knew about as much about King Arthur as you do. And what I thought I knew was that he was a king who lived in England in the Middle Ages. And it turned out all 3 of those things were wrong. The story of King Arthur starts about 2,000 years ago, in 43 AD, when the Roman Emperor Claudius invaded Britain. Claudius, he had a lot to prove. He didn't have a military background. Apparently, he drooled a lot. So invading Britain seemed like a good idea for establishing his credibility as an emperor. And it was it was sort of one of these amazing moments of cultural contact because uh, Rome was at its height. It was an incredibly powerful, sophisticated civilization, and Britain was really still in the Iron Age. And so when the Romans arrived, it was like aliens arriving from more advanced more advanced species with advanced technologies. The British did not have writing at that time. They didn't make coins. They didn't have glass. They didn't have plumbing. Um, and the Romans sort of descended on Britain and began to remake it in their image. The British did not have what we call dressed stone, which is just stone that looks like a smooth-sided that makes sort of a smooth-sided wall. And the Romans did, and they built roads, and they built temples, and baths, and aqueducts, and entire cities. Um, they brought foods that the British had never seen before. They brought rabbits, pheasants. They brought cabbage, which personally it's hard for me to imagine Britain in a time without cabbage. But apparently they didn't have cabbage yet. They brought this. They sort of plugged Britain into this amazing uh, international trade network, which reached the whole rest of the Roman Empire, as far as the Middle East. And the Romans stayed in Britain for 350 years. And then, relatively suddenly, they left again. And when that happened, all of that new civilization that they had built in Britain, it completely collapsed. Uh, and this period began that historians call the Dark Ages, mostly because we don't really know what happened then. Uh, but we do know that the British, they lost all of that technology that they had picked up from the Romans. They abandoned the cities that the Romans built, and they let them fall to ruin. All of Britain was a landscape littered with ruins, ruined villas, ruined temples that the Romans had left behind. And this was the world into which King Arthur was born. Uh, it, I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that it was a kind of a lot like Mad Max, but instead of Mad Max, it was King Arthur. And you could see already um, why that story, the story of Arthur, would be so compelling in that historical moment. Because story of Arthur is a story about a king who unites a shattered country and brings people together, who brings order and peace and calm where there wasn't any. The inevitable question arises, did Arthur exist? And my position on that, and I'm sticking to it, is that we don't know, and we will never know. Uh, there are so it's hard to exaggerate. There are so little written sources about what was happening in Britain at that time. There's really just one by a writer named Gildas, who was writing around 500. Unfortunately, he does not mention Arthur. The first time we see Arthur mentioned in anything like a written record is in a poem, which is called it's in Old Welsh. I apologize to all Old Welsh speakers in the audience for my Welsh accent, which is non-existent, but it's basically called a Gododin. And it's hard to date because it was an it was an oral tradition. It was part of an oral tradition. It wasn't initially written down, but people think that maybe it was written around 600 AD, so 200 years after the Romans left Britain. And Agamemnon, it's not a story, it's a series of elegies for some warriors who fell in battle. And one of the elegies goes like this. He pierced 300, most bold. He cut down the center and wing. He was worthy before the noblest host. He gave from his herd horses in winter. He fed black ravens on the wall of the fortress, but he was not Arthur. In other words, what we would say, he was no Arthur. And that was it. That's the mention. That's the first mention of Arthur in the entirety of written literature. And already, what we understand from it is that he was already so famous, like Madonna. You didn't have to say which Madonna. You didn't have to say which Arthur it was. And I'll only note that at this point, Arthur was not a king. Arthur is a warrior. Um, he's a warlord. The Latin for what he was is Dux Bellorum. Apologies to other Latin speakers. I don't really know it very well, but it's something like a leader in war. Um, and he was also, and I find this very interesting, he was a Romanized Briton. He was Celtic. He was of the indigenous tribe that lived in Britain. But he would have adopted Roman ways. He would have spoken Latin. He would have been Christian. Um, he lived in this very brief interval in British history where the Romans were gone, the Saxons had not yet taken over. So there's this little moment where the Celticness of Britain is able to thrive. But Arthur would have been more Roman than Celt. Um, he would have talked like a Roman, dressed like a Roman. And in the early stories about Arthur, he was a resistance hero. He was fighting to keep the Saxons out. He fought a series of battles, and in the last one at Camlan, he died. And there's many strange things about the story. One of them is that Arthur, as I hinted above, was not English. And I love the way that English people love King Arthur. Just to be super clear, Arthur was fighting the Anglo-Saxons who were attempting to invade Britain, or at least settle in Britain. Um, Anglo means the Angles, which was a Germanic tribe. Because the Angles won and Arthur lost, that's why we call England England. So King Arthur, one thing we know about King Arthur, he hated the English. He spent his life fighting to keep the English out of England, and he died doing it. Um, so there's a certain amount of irony in the way that the English people embrace Arthur. He probably doesn't like it wherever he is. There's a story about J.R.R. Tolkien, who wrote The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings. He also wrote a story about King Arthur, um, or he wrote half of a story about King Arthur. And there's a letter to his publisher, which he wrote. He sort of felt like he needed to explain why he was not going to finish his story about King Arthur. And apart from there were a number of reasons why he didn't finish it, but one of them basically was that uh, Tolkien was a Saxon. He was pro-Saxon. He was Team Saxon, and he realized that he was not rooting for King Arthur. Another strange thing about the story is that it's a tragedy. It's a story about a hero, but it's not a story about a winner. Arthur is like Charlie Brown. Uh, Even from the very beginning, uh, he's destined to lose. But the strangest thing about this story is that it did not die when Arthur died. Something about this story um, compelled people to keep on telling it. Uh, they repeated it to their children, and their children passed it on. Uh, the Arthur story really doesn't get written down fully until the 1100s. So if you picture, we're starting in the 600s. This is a story that was told and retold for 500 years. Imagine coming up with a story that will still be told in the year 2500. Uh, it's truly miraculous. The first time anybody really wrote down the Arthur story in any detail, it was in the 1100s or the 12th century. It was a guy named Geoffrey of Monmouth, another person that we don't know very much about. But he wrote down the story and he kind of transformed it. He kind of took a lot of liberties with it. He decided that Arthur would be a king, not a Dux Bellorum. He decided that Arthur would have a wizard called Merlin. Merlin was a folk. He had his own mythology at that time, but uh, um, Geoffrey of Monmouth did a kind of crossover fan fiction between Arthur and Merlin, and now Merlin is stuck with Arthur forever. He had a queen called Guinevere. He had a treacherous nephew called Mordred. Sometimes when you take liberties with a story, it kind of kills the story. In the case of Geoffrey of Monmouth, he immortalized it. It became the 12th century equivalent of a huge bestseller, which means there was probably like 500 copies of it. And I have to think about why then? Um, what was it about that moment in history that caused people to write down the Arthur story and kind of codify it forever? Um, and if you picture 1066, that was when the Normans came and they had battle and they took over England. It was the first time in a very long time when it was not cool to be Anglo-Saxon in Britain. The Normans were in charge now. And you could imagine, and this is the conventional wisdom about the Arthur story, uh, a story about a king who may one day return to Britain. in triumph from over the sea, a king who hated Saxons. You could imagine why the Normans might be into a story of that kind. I'll also point out that when Geoffrey of Monmouth is writing, there was no king in Britain. Henry the First had died. He didn't have a son, or he had a son, but the son died. He had a bunch of nephews, and he had a daughter. One of the nephews and the daughter, Matilda, had a massive civil war, which lasted for 25 years. It devastated England. It's called the Anarchy. And you can imagine, again, somebody writing in that time, in that moment, and the longing they must have felt for a king who would come and make everything okay. Just interesting side note about Arthur. You would think, given how much the English love Arthur, that they would at least name one of their own kings Arthur. And in fact, there have been several attempts to do so. The grandson of Henry II was Arthur. He was in line for the throne until he was murdered by his uncle, King John. Henry VIII's older brother was also named Arthur. He also was set to rule, but he died of illness. I think there's a perception now by the royal family that Arthur is something of a cursed name, and so they seem to have given up calling kings Arthur. But you know, we live in hope. So this story, another property that it had was that it changed constantly. Every time somebody wrote down this story or told this story, they added something to it or they changed something. So Geoffrey of Monmouth writes it down. The next version, the person who wrote it gave him a round table where all his knights could sit and feel equal. Somebody else decided that Mordred was not Arthur's nephew, that he was Arthur's son. And furthermore, he was a son by Arthur's own half sister, which is unsavory, but there we have it. And the story traveled. It wasn't just an English story anymore. It crossed the channel. The French people had a massive craze for Arthur. They loved Arthur. And they too changed the story. They added a castle called Camelot. They decided that it was a Christian story. They decided that the knights should seek the Holy Grail. And that changed what the story was about, what it meant. It became this story about people who were trying to achieve an ideal that they ultimately could not because they were fallible humans. And that added another dimension to the tragedy. They also, in their French way, made it a love story. Until this time, until the French got a hold of it, the knights, they didn't really have a lot of feelings. They were rough, tough, sort of Dark Ages warlords. But in the hands of the French, they suddenly had love affairs. And the story became about love and lust. And if you ever wonder why there is a French guy hanging around a Camelot named Lancelot, who is the best knight in the world and seduces the Queen of England, it's because the French made up Lancelot. And they also decided, and this is sort of my favorite bit, they also decided that Arthur should pull a sword from a stone. And at the end of his life, they added a scene where Arthur gave his sword, Excalibur, back to the water. I can't exaggerate how amazing it is that that scene exists in Arthur because it's a very in Britain before the time before Claudius came in the Iron Age, more than 1,000 years earlier, there was a ritual, which was that when a great warrior died, his weapons would be retired, and the way you retired them would be by throwing them in the water. And that idea, that ritual somehow survived more than 1,000 years. It survived the Romans, it survived the Saxons, and it reemerges at the end of Arthur's story. And it was written into it, and now it lives forever. And we still tell the story. We have been telling it nonstop for 1,400 years, including me. The Bright Sword came out a year ago, and it was not the only King Arthur novel published last year. Probably it was not the only King Arthur novel that was published that week. It's a little embarrassing in a way to have written a King Arthur story because we already have so many of them. And I wanted to say a few things about why I felt like I had to. One thing about the Arthur story, and we've touched on this, is that it changes and its meaning changes. If for the Welsh, it was a resistance story. For Geoffrey of Monmouth, it was about kingship. For the French, it was about love. It was about seeking to become an ideal. When T.H. White wrote The Once and Future King, he was writing in the shadow of World War II, and it became a story about war and violence and the way that humans can't seem to stop killing each other. It became The Mists of Avalon, which became a story about feminism and to a lesser extent neo-paganism. Um, the story of Arthur constantly changes its meaning. Um, in order to become about the world in which it's being written down. In a funny way, the King Arthur is always telling us things about the moment in which we are telling his story. And I began to wonder, what would it mean to tell a King Arthur story now? What could King Arthur tell us about the world that we are living in? And I thought that, on the face of it, the answer seemed like not too much. King Arthur was he was a white guy. He was middle aged. He was incredibly wealthy. Surely we've heard from such people already, and we've heard from them enough. What could he have to tell us that would be new? Um, it was an interesting problem, and yet I felt sure Arthur always comes back. People always find a new way to tell the story. And so I went back and I read the Morte d'Arthur again, and to see if there was anything in it that I felt like resonated with the world around me. And the strange thing is that there was. I mentioned earlier, I think the first thing I noticed, I mentioned earlier that Arthur was a Romanized Briton. He was a Briton who had assimilated to Roman culture. I found that very interesting. Usually, when we tell heroic stories now about indigenous people resisting colonial oppressors, the heroes are the indigenous people. But Arthur wasn't like that. He thought of himself as a Roman. He probably was waiting for the Romans to come back. Um, if you tell this as a post-colonial story, Arthur is part of the apparatus that the colonial powers left behind. He's like, essentially, he's a collaborator. I found that very interesting, and it caused me to sense that there is a journey that Arthur has yet to go on. It it is a story, it is always a story about somebody wrestling with the past. Arthur is a perfect king. He's a great king. He's a good person, and he always falls. And what brings him down is the past, the wrongdoings of the past, the invasion of Britain by the Romans, the seduction of Igraine, his own sleeping with his half sister, and that seemed very real to me. I feel like in America, one of the problems that we are struggling with is how to deal with our own past and the atrocities in it. Um, and it was something Arthur wrestled with too. But the real moment came for me when I went back and reread The Once and Future King by T.H. White. One of the strokes of genius that T.H. White had, and I didn't realize this when I read the story initially, was the idea of telling a story of Arthur's childhood. All that stuff that T.H. White wrote about Arthur living in the countryside, having Merlin as his tutor, um, getting picked on by Kay, getting turned into different animals and learning life lessons. He made that up. Excuse me. He made that up out of whole cloth. No one had ever told that story before. No one had ever given us Arthur as a little boy. And in a way, we'd never felt that close to King Arthur before. We'd never seen him that vulnerable. And it made me think about, well, if T.H. White had found this blank space on the map that nobody had filled in, were there other blank spaces? Were there other parts of the story that even after something like 1400 years, were there aspects of the story that we haven't told? And I started thinking about another blank space, which is the time after Arthur's death. There's something interesting to me about that world. Arthur was kind of he was the center of his world. He was the sort of the sun around which everything revolved. And when he died, um, his world fell apart. And something about that broken world where the pillar that held it up has collapsed, the kind of North Star that everybody steered by to tell them what was right and what was good was gone. There was something very modern about that story. It was almost like it's almost existentialist. It was like a waiting for Godot quality to it. Um, it felt like our world, this sort of disenchanted, disarrayed world that we live in. There's an obvious reason why people don't write about the world after Arthur, which is that Arthur's not in it. Doesn't seem like a great setting for a King Arthur story. But I did, when I reread Mallory, something else that struck me was that the ending, in a way, it's quite unsatisfying. Arthur dies. He doesn't have a living son or daughter. And instead, the crown passes to a guy named Constantine, who we basically never heard of. And Constantine rules wisely and well, and that's the end of that story. Now, as we know, in fact, as we've alluded to, we love the British, but one thing that the British love is a succession crisis. If the king dies and everything isn't sort of tickety boo, that's all they need to have a massive civil war and a factional struggle. And it seems to me that's what it would have happened after Arthur's death, because there was no heir um, with a strong claim to the throne. And that, of course, it's a story of Game of Thrones. I'm a big Game of Thrones fan. Uh, the Game of Thrones is a big succession crisis. And in a way, I almost did a thought experiment. What if the king who dies is not Robert Baratheon? What if it's King Arthur? Of course, there was a problem that I also found when I reread Mallory, which is that when Arthur dies, almost everybody dies with him. Bedivere doesn't die, Sir Bedivere, because he needs to throw the sword into the water. But none of the great ones are left. There is no Gawain, he died. There's no Gareth, there's no Percival, there's no Tristram, there's no Galahad. Uh, Lancelot is still alive because it's impossible to kill Lancelot, but he is retired in a monastery. None of the characters who we love to tell these stories about, they weren't there. At which point, I was tempted to give up until it occurred to me that in a way, this is a feature and not a bug. Because if there are so few people left alive, if all the heroes are gone, then who's going to play the story? What has to happen is you need to take people from the edges of the story, people who have never been heroes. These characters who, like Sir Bedivere, who's always standing faithfully beside King Arthur, but is never the hero himself, um, to find these characters and bring them to the center of the story. And these people are not heroes. They don't feel like heroes. They've never been heroes before. And yet, because of what is happening in the world around them, they have to become heroes. And that story, the story of having to become a hero when you don't know if you truly can, that seemed like a good story. That seemed like a story worth telling. Uh, and there's something else about it. When I write, I like to break rules when I'm writing. I like to look at the conventions of the kind of story I'm telling and see, well, which of these rules can I break? Because that's what's exciting about writing. And one of the cardinal rules of King Arthur's story, of course, is that is a tragedy, and it ends with his death. But it makes you think, Arthur dies, and the world collapses. What happens to all those other people who had to live on in that world without Arthur? If you keep the cameras rolling, as it were, after his death, and pointed at those other people, it changes what the story's about. Uh, it is a story, it's still a tragedy, but it's not just a tragedy. It's more than a tragedy. It becomes about how do you keep living when everything has fallen apart uh, in that world, because that's our world. We have to live in a world without King Arthur. And suddenly the story, it wasn't just Arthur's story, it was our story too. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Lev, very much for that. Um, I I listened to The Bright Sword. Um, and it really, and then I read it because I do both, because there's a different experience in both. But the
Right.
way everything really came alive in a different way, like a different version between the two, was really fascinating. And hearing all of the history about it that you've just mentioned is just layers on layers. Um, so let's see. We will take questions, everyone, in the Q&A box if you'd like. And I hope the question I'm about to ask doesn't give anything away for those who may not have finished or read yet. But where did the character column come from?
Well, it's a fair question. Column. So this King Arthur, the story of the Bright Sword, it's King Arthur's story, and it's also the story of this young man named Colum. In a way, we sort of tell these two stories in parallel. Colum is he's a strapping young lad, very good with a sword. As you did, he turns up at Camelot, but he realizes when he gets there that he's come too late. He's missed everything, and Arthur is dead. Um, and in some ways, Colum he's a stock character out of the Arthurian tradition. They used to call him the Belle Inconnu, the handsome young man who shows up with, but he's a person of mystery. Nobody really knows who his parents are. That was Colum. And so I wanted to begin with that idea, just having somebody who could be our proxy in a way, exploring this new world, the Arthurless world, um, even while telling a King Arthur story. Uh, but I call him is he's actually a complicated person. He's quite innocent in some ways, but he has undergone a lot of trauma in his childhood. His feelings about Camelot are complicated. He comes from the north, which was the country of the Gaels, which Arthur conquered, but he was always seen there as an interloper. He himself was considered a kind of colonial occupier, and everybody hated him. Uh, Colum was a Gael and lived there, but he hated where he lived, and he hated everybody who he lived with. And so, as a result, out of perversity, he came to love King Arthur and decided that he was going to join Camelot. So there are some wrinkles to Colum, which make him a little complicated. Also, he has to lie because he's not nobly born, and you really have to be nobly born to be on the round table. Uh, if you think about it, there are some ways in which Colum's story and Arthur's story parallel each other. Colum and Arthur both struggle with some of the same things. Arthur was an orphan. He also was traumatized. And part of the point of Colum and his story is looking at somebody who is going through some of the same trials that Arthur did and wondering, is there another way to end this story that is not a tragedy? Can Colum find his way to a different kind of resolution? Uh, that is the point of Colum. Whether or not he does so, I will leave to your imaginations.
I enjoyed him very much as a character. Um, okay, so our next question is from Alex. Mr. Grossman, I've enjoyed your novels very much, both Bright Sword and The Magician's books. I've also enjoyed your brother's Austen novels very much. Have the two of you considered ever collaborating?
Um, that's an interesting question. A strange fact about me, which people may not know, is that I have an identical twin. And my identical twin is, what are the odds, is also a writer, a novelist. And he writes amazing books that are fantastic. And there are times when I envy him because he writes so well. And but we have a lot in common. Our imaginations, in some ways, work very similar ways. We certainly read each other's work in progress and talk about it. Um, I actually once asked him to collaborate with me, and he said, "No, no, it's not a good idea." And I can see that in a way. Like all twins, we have a close bond. But would it be putting our bond at risk to try to work together? Uh, I don't know. He clearly felt that way. So at this point, probably it will never happen. But in a way, all our books are collaborations because we talk about them with each other so much, and you can see a lot of similarities between our two books.
Is he one of your first readers?
He is one of my first readers, yeah, and in some ways, it's both a good and bad thing. He uh, he always knows what I'm trying to say, which is a great thing because then he can sort of help me say it if I'm not saying it clearly enough. But he's not a typical reader. Most readers do not have a psychic bond with me. So it's always important for me to then take it to people who might not be so good at guessing what it is that I have to say to make absolutely sure that I am saying it.
So, which was the first Arthurian book you fell in love with, and how old were you when you first read it?
It was definitely the Once and Future King. Uh, and I have a vivid memory of being in junior high and playing dodgeball. I don't know if everybody's played dodgeball. It's that horrible game where you throw balls at each other and try to get each other out. But I remember I was so obsessed with this book and so deeply into it. And I remember having a kind of waking dream that we were not just a dodgeball team, we were the Knights of the Round Table fighting against the other dodgeball team in our noble quest to win a game, win a game of dodgeball. Um, that dates it for me. I must have been about 13 if I was in the gym uh, at my junior high uh, playing dodgeball. But I read it and reread it so many times. I'm sure that I've read that book more times than I've read any other book.
I was never good at dodgeball, and I dreaded it. It was the game that we played when it rained outside. Anyway, our next question. Um, let's see. Um, Daisy says, my favorite part of the story includes the quote, stories never really ended. They just rolled one into the next. The past was never wholly lost, and the future never quite found. It reminds me a little of Gatsby's Ceaseless Boats. Was that intentional?
um, like a lot of writers, I think when writers come to the end, a lot of writers, when they come to the end of their books, they think about that paragraph that Fitzgerald wrote because it is kind of it's one of the great closing paragraphs of any novel anywhere. Uh, I was thinking about it to tell the truth. That is a correct idea. Uh, and I actually feel quite influenced by Fitzgerald. I think of myself as a fantasy writer, but I did study literature in college and in grad school. I've read a lot of stuff outside of fantasy, especially the modernists, especially that period that Fitzgerald was in. And I always feel that uh, I'm stealing from them when I write fantasy.
Are we really stealing from the writers that we've read when everything we read is incorporated back into our own brains?
It's a good question. And I think it was T.S. Eliot who said that good artists borrow, great artists steal. And he should know since he stole a lot of stuff. Um, uh, uh, One of the things that I feel like you have to come to terms with at some point as a writer is that at some point every story has been told. The basic outlines of every story are sort of out there in the culture. And it's a little bit of a leap of faith that you have to take that when you take that story into yourself and decide that you're going to tell it, it will be transformed enough to be something new. Uh, so I hope that F. Scott Fitzgerald, wherever he is, doesn't feel too badly about me having stolen the cadence of his final paragraph.
Highly doubtful. Let's see what's up next. I loved this book and your Substack about the writing of it. What is next?
That's a fair question. I think I mentioned that the right sort. It took me a long time to write. It took me 10 years to write, which is an incredibly long time. I often think about the fact that Susanna Clarke took 10 years to write Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell, which is one of my favorite books. And I take comfort from the fact that I'm not the only one who got that stuck on their book. But while I was writing, I had a lot of other ideas, which I'm now sort of running around trying to put into play. I always wanted to write science fiction, and especially I always wanted to write a story like a space opera, like Star Wars, with giant spaceships and lasers and hyperdrives and whatever else. And I've decided that the time has come. Uh, Oddly, I'm writing it as a graphic novel, not as a regular novel, which is interesting. It's a certainly a learning curve, learning to write comics, which is not the same as novels or screenplays. The other thing I've learned about graphic novels is it takes a very long time for the person who's drawing them to draw them. So this probably won't be out until 2027, but it is coming eventually. Uh, but I'm also writing I'm writing another novel. I write just a regular old novel. My children went through uh, a big Percy Jackson phase, like many children, which meant that I went through a Percy Jackson phase. I read most of what there is of Percy Jackson, and I started to think I love Percy Jackson, and yet it was like the Arthur story. I started to feel like that world, which is our world, but sort of interpenetrated by um, gods and spirits and monsters in that mythological way. It is such a fascinating setting. And I started to think about whether there was another kind of story that you could tell there. Maybe something more grown up than Percy Jackson. I don't know. Uh, but that is on the way. It doesn't even have a title yet, but it's about a quarter done. Hopefully, it will not take 10 years.
Well, it sounds like if you're working on a new novel now and you're pacing out a graphic novel with the artist, that maybe there is some good cadence happening there. We can hope. Let's see. We've got a couple more questions. I think we have time for one or two more. I love the focus on the relationship between main characters and side characters. Which character, either in the Bright Swords or the Magicians, was the most fun for you to write?
It's a good question. And I feel that as a matter of honor, I probably shouldn't answer it because I feel as though that I should appreciate all of my characters the same, and I do. Um, but I found it very easy for some reason to write the voice of Sir Palomides. Palomides is a Muslim knight, possibly the only Muslim in Britain, and he comes from Baghdad, which, like the Roman Empire, is a very advanced civilization. And he comes to Britain to sort of explore it, and he discovers that it's unbelievably primitive, and everybody around him are barbarians. Um, but he can't leave because he has fallen in love. Uh, and for some reason, I found uh, I really liked his voice, and I found it very easy to write. And I wrote about 7 Palomides chapters, which I had to then cut most of. So there's only 2 in the book, but I enjoyed it a lot. With the magicians, um, I'm sure that Janet is the character that I enjoyed writing the most. Janet, if you've read The Magicians, um, she speaks her mind. She doesn't self-edit hugely. She just puts it out there, and it's a quality that I admire about Janet. And as a just relentless self-editor, I sometimes wish that I could just let it all out. Um, but I can't. Janet can, and when I'm Janet, then I can too.
That's a nice way to think about that. Oh, yeah, I bet I have some characters that would like to speak their mind as well. Let's see. Oh, I think someone is unmuted. Okay, there we go. Um, King Arthur hated the English. Who knew? I didn't, so thank you for that. Are you considering writing about another historical character with precious little to go on fact-wise? Would you ever write a book like this again?
Um, when I finished The Bright Sword, I swore a mighty oath that I would never write another historical novel. It took me 10 years, and part of it was for me was research, trying to put together as a layman what felt like a historically solid version of Arthur's world. And I just spent years reading books about the Middle Ages and the Dark Ages, and trying then to shape this huge mound of research that I'd done into a story that anybody would ever want to read. I found it very challenging. And I swore on my oath that I would never try to do it again. That said, I've sworn to do lots of things or never do lots of things that I've ended up doing. Um, I always wonder about Robin Hood, another not very well shadowy historical figure. I thought about at the end of the Bright Sword having Colin go off and become Robin Hood as a twist,
Oh,
but
that
I
would have
tried
been
it.
fun.
I promise you that it did not work. Here in Lisbon. But it was a fun idea.
Well, you actually just partially answered the next question, which was, have you researched more works in the Arthurian oeuvre, like the Christian de Troyes, um, Monty Python, all of the different, all of the different.
Um, I will say that running the Bright Sword, it has given me a new appreciation for Monty Python, even more than I had already. And I ended up using a quote from Monty Python as one of the epigraphs. If you're trying to um, do a rule-breaking, sometimes comical version of King Arthur, what you discover is that you have to get up pretty early in the morning to think of something that the Monty Python people didn't think of. They clearly, apart from everything else, they obviously knew a great deal about King Arthur. Um, I'm trying to think. Sorry, I don't know if I answered the question or not. Um, I do think about the parts of King Arthur that I didn't get to. Um, there are versions in the book of most of the great canonical scenes, like pulling the sword from the stone or Bedivere throwing the sword back at the end. But there's bits that escaped me. I never got to write a version of Arthur getting Excalibur, for example.
Mhm.
There's tons of stories about Tristram and things like that that didn't get to. Uh, I still think about them.
All right. Well, we've got time for one last question, also related. So, because there are so many retellings and so much scholarship around Arthur and the Round Table, what was the most surprising and interesting thing you learned along the way while you were researching and writing The Bright Sword?
That's a good question. Um, there were a lot of little things that I did. I mean,
Hmm.
um, you really I can't overstate how little I knew about that historical period. But I remember reading a history. It's tricky. Novelists want different things out of history than historians do. So I was always looking for little details about the ways people lived and what their lives were like. And I remember coming across the detail that in the 12th century, pillows were an effete aristocratic invention, and most people didn't have any truck with them. Which raises the question, what do they put their heads on when they lay down to go to sleep? And the answer is a log. Everybody had a log that they put their head on when they went they went to sleep. I found that so amazing, and that I had to put it in the book. And in a funny way, it really puts you. It's one of those mundane details that really makes you realize that it was a different world back then. But
I can't imagine.
but then there were much bigger things too. I never understood what it meant for Arthur to be a Romanized Britain until I realized that his story is a post-colonial story, and he's a little bit on the wrong side of history, which was unbelievably fascinating. Uh, there's something else I was going to mention. Oh, just the very fact that there are different schools of thought about what the Saxons were doing in Britain. I always thought, and I was always taught, that the Saxons invaded Britain, took it over, and that was that story. There are historians who believe that the Saxons were themselves refugees. They were fleeing. They were fleeing the Huns. Their lands were flooding. This idea that the Saxons hadn't come, with fire and blood, but they'd come just in open boats, looking for somewhere that they could possibly make their home. I found that very touching. And if you read the book, you'll see that it makes its way in there.
Not dissimilar to some of the things happening in the world right now.
It's very recognizable.
Um, yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Lev Grossman, for being part of the Salem Lit Fest 2025. It's been wonderful having you. And as a fan of your work, I'm grateful to have had this opportunity and to have been part of planning this session with you. Um,
Thank you. It's a real pleasure to be here and to return virtually to the land of my birth,
Welcome back. It's a little toastier here than it is where you are, I think.
probably.
Before we wrap up, I would like to shout out to our LitFest presenters and partners, the Salem Athenaeum and the Salem Public Library, the House of the Seven Gables, Salem Maritime National Historic Site, Essex National Heritage, Theater in the Open, 5 Minutes Molecule Literary Magazine, the North Shore CDC, Urban Art Museum, the Salem YMCA, Cinema Salem, St. Peter San Pedro Episcopal Church, Salem State University, Peabody Essex Museum, and the City of Salem Community Life Center, and not to forget at our in-person events, some delicious treats from Coffee Time Bake Shop. Essential funding was provided by the Salem Cultural Council, Massachusetts Center for the and Massachusetts Center for the Book. Wicked Good Books, where you can buy your festival books online in Salem or from your favorite bookseller. North Shore Bank, Salem 5, and anonymous supporters along with Brunonia Berry, Christine Gladley, Joyce Maroney, Paul Morneau, Alexa Noda, Sarah Shekels, Genevieve and Naveen Sinha, and a friend of the festival, and of course, readers like you who donate to the festival. Our festival continues through Sunday, tomorrow evening in person at the House of Seven Gables in Salem, an event called Enduring Hawthorne. Saturday, we have a bunch of in-person sessions and events for all ages. SalemLitFest.org has the full list, and it's not too late to sign up for any of what's ahead, including our One Book, One Salem read on Sunday afternoon with Julia Alvarez. Thank you to our audience and for your support and your great questions. And thank you again, Lev. Everyone have a great evening.